Well, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames, mademoiselles, messieurs, I'm privileged to chair this session today, and I'm very honored to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Zen Faulkes, who is currently program director of DORA. I recall you that DORA is the Declaration on Research Assessment, and the mission of DORA is to recognize the need to improve the ways in which researchers and the outputs of scholarly research are evaluated. I think this is a very, very important mission. Zen is a scientist, a biologist. He was formerly employed as a faculty member in School of Interdisciplinary Science at McMaster University, Ontario, Canada, and even earlier at a faculty in biology at the University of Texas Pan American, later renamed to the University of Texas Rio Grande, right? His research interest is biology, and especially crustaceans, I can't spell it, Skorupiaki anyway, so crabs, lobsters, their brains, their behavior, and their evolution. Zen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be speaking to you today. So I thank you very much for the invitation. And I will just take a moment. I understand that there's much discussion that is usually part of these seminars, but I will take a few minutes just to talk give you a little bit of an introduction about the organization that I am now working for. I have been in this role for a little under a year now, coming from the rank and file faculty as a working scientist to move into science policy. And this was sort of the initial title that I suggested about what should research assessment be trying to achieve. Although yesterday I was on LinkedIn and I saw a moment about an online seminar, and I saw something that was described as a little differently of alternative ways of evaluating scientific achievements. And so I thought, well, those two things go together. So which either title works, I can do either one of those. I will do both of them. But the first, I think, is really informative. What are we trying to achieve? That really determines what new ways you want to try to assess research in. And I think that I'll come back to that a few times through this presentation. I do want to take a little moment and expand a little bit on the introduction of my host about what DORA is, where we have been, and what the organization is attempting to achieve. Nations around the world are investing large amounts of money and resources into research, and it is right and logical and necessary that there has to be some sort of an assessment that they are getting a return on their investment. Of course, that has to happen. And it also makes sense that the people who are charged with assessment, who have to do that they would want to use some sort of numeric evidence, right? You have people who, like myself, are coming from a science background. That's why part of the reason why they are charged with scientific assessment, because they understand working with scientists. And so they are often very interested in having numbers to support decisions. So again, all of that sounds very good. But the problem is that many of those numbers that have over time become very commonly used are very deeply flawed for that purpose. So just because there's a number does not mean it's a helpful number. And so the idea of DORA is to try to find and support other ways to assess research. And particularly, I would say that DORA has expanded and changed a little bit. Last year, when I joined, was a special year for DORA because it was the 10th anniversary. And originally, although nobody calls it the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, that is where it started. Currently, DORA is part of the American Society for Cell Biology because that is the organization that originally started this whole thing. At the 2012 meeting, there was a group of individuals there who came up with a set of principles. And in the following year, that was published as the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment. And that is still why on our website, the website name is sfdora.org for San Francisco Declaration Research Assessment. And one of the things that really surprised me when I took over the role and I really started to see the numbers is that even though the original declaration that people could start to sign on to was more than 10 years ago, almost every day we still have people coming in and signing on to DORA, and it's incredibly steady. Typically, every few months, there's a few hundred more people. And so we expect to hit 25,000 signatories in a few months, just at the rate that we are going. And so there's this ongoing interest in research assessment shown by the number of people who are continually signing on to say, yes, we would like to do research assessment better. And that idea of just sort of the signatures, that DORA was a list of signatures that started at this meeting, was probably true for about 5 years or so. About 5 years ago, there was a switch, and DORA really changed from being just a list of signatures of people, who agreed to the principles, the major one of not using journal impact factor for research assessment, but there were other things in there as well. And it really became an organization, a small organization, but one with a global reach. We really have spent a lot of effort to try to incorporate members of our steering committee from around the world and to really be thinking about research assessment on a global scale. And in that sense, some of the things that DORA is now doing is that we are trying to create resource libraries. We are trying to create, and well, we're not trying, we are succeeding. We are creating new tools for research assessment. The most recent one you can see on the slide here is called Reformscape. That just launched at the end of January, so it is less than 1 month old. We can talk a little bit more about Reformscape later if you would like. We have discussion groups for funding agencies, for people who have initiatives. Occasionally, DORA publishes reports, sometimes in conjunction with other organizations. So we are a small but very active organization. And so that's been the last roughly 5 years of DORA's existence. And so that's our overarching mission, right? Is to figure out better ways to assess research. And although I am a scientist and much of the research assessment focuses on scientific research, primarily because that's where the most money is. So that's where the most interest in assessment comes in. We are not simply about scientific scholarship and assessment of scientific scholarship. We are interested in how the humanities assessed, how all the different scholarly disciplines are being assessed in their research. So the fact that it is sometimes a little bit biased towards science is not a deliberate thing on our part. We really are interested in these other forms of scholarly research and how they're being assessed, even though much of the activity and much of the interest is initially coming on the scientific side. So we do have, as part of the fact that we are now an organization, we do have a few objectives, and these were drafted last year, I believe, a little over a year ago. And we are still involved in consciousness raising and trying to make people aware of some of the problems of, say, using the journal impact factor to assess an individual researcher, which is still a very common practice in many places. And we are looking at ways to see how research reform is progressing and support the people who are advocates for reforming research. And then finally, of course, we want to make sure that the organization continues to be well supported so that we can deliver on all of these programming and initiatives that DORA is participating in. And I do want to mention briefly that one of the things that DORA is best known for is its criticism of the journal impact factor as a method of research assessment. And this is something that, as I mentioned, is still a fairly common practice, even though this has been something that people have been arguing about and pointing out the issues around the journal impact factor well before DORA was initially founded back in 2012, 2013. And these are just a few examples of articles that have been published in various scientific journals about the journal impact factor. And I'll just give as an example, one very well-known flaw. The journal impact factor is an average of the number of citations. And so the idea that what many people argue is that if you're in a high impact factor journal, there's going to be more readership, and that the work that you publish there is more likely to have more citations. But the difficulty is that the distributions of those citations in a journal is really, really driven by outliers. The distribution is very, very, very highly skewed. But the journal impact factor is an arithmetic mean. It's an average. And so it doesn't, so those outliers really can change the impact factor quite significantly. If a journal, in some cases, some journals will have one single paper that becomes very, very highly cited, and the impact factor can fluctuate wildly for a couple of years because of that one single paper. So in terms of trying to use the impact factor to predict what an individual article's future is going to be in terms of citation, in terms of influence, just turns out to be deeply, deeply a flawed problem, a flawed scenario. It's not really possible in any meaningful sense. So with that, in terms of the background of what DORA is been concerned about and so forth, what are some of the things that DORA thinks, well, what do we want to achieve with research assessment? And I came up with a way of thinking about this that was helpful to me. And I thought about research assessment and the fact that we have, on the one hand, we have things like the journal impact factor, which people like to use because it's a nice, simply easy to understand number. It's easy to compare. It's easy to sort of understand averages. And I thought, well, okay, well, that sort of represents one end of a continuum. That's one way to assess research, is with numbers, right? A quantitative assessment. The other way that you can assess research is by using something that is a little bit more based in narrative, is something that maybe more the humanities might do, something that is a more qualitative kind of assessment. So as a biologist, when we talk about, say, the influence of a biologist such as Charles Darwin, just to bring one name out of nowhere, we talk about Charles Darwin as an influential scientist not because of the number of papers he published or the number of times one of his books has been cited, right? We talk about that because we know the influence he had on the field of biology. And that is not a numeric assessment of Charles Darwin's research, right? It's a qualitative assessment. Now, in my experience as a researcher, as a scientist, I have never, ever encountered a research assessment in my career or anyone else's that is purely quantitative, right? It's just submit these numbers and we're done. I have never seen one that is purely qualitative either. There's always been a mix of these two things. Um, and so I think that we can think of that assessment as sort of sitting on that scale. And I think that it's useful though, even acknowledging that there's a continuum. Some research assessments are more on the quantitative numeric side. Some are more on the qualitative side. And it can be useful to think about, well, what are the pros and cons of the extreme ends of that? And if we have something which is a purely qualitative assessment, I think there are some very clear and obvious shortcomings to that. One of which is that some people might say, well, if you have just somebody's opinion, so to speak, that is something that could be very subject to personal biases. And it is difficult for someone else to perhaps understand the underlying reasons and basis for that opinion. And at the extreme level, you could have somebody who is just awarding research funding or positions, these sorts of things, in a process that is completely corrupted and is just, well, because I say so. And I don't think anybody wants that, right? But we sort of see accusations of that all the time. And so I think that given that, the attraction of metrics, of numbers, of that quantitative assessment seem appealing. It looks like it is objective. Once you have a number, you have something that gives you a very quick assessment. 12 is higher than 11. Let's give the money to the person who with the score of 12, and you're done. So that seems like something that is very easy to do, very appealing. But we also want to acknowledge that when you have that kind of extreme numbers-driven assessment, that there are risks involved with that. I talked a little bit more about the journal impact factor. It's a very simple number. It's very easy to compare. But as I talked about before, there can be an illusion of objectivity behind that. Does that number really convey the thing that we are trying to capture? And we've also seen an increasing problem with people who are attempting to manipulate these numbers in some way, that not just by doing great science, but by engaging in some kind of tactics that are unethical in not good practice. And at the extreme, when you have these numbers where there can be very, very fine differences, you essentially end up with an inability to discriminate because you're just within measurement error. And I think that there's been many cases where people have looked at, say, a set of grant proposals, and they've said, all of these are really good, really good. They're probably going to produce good science. And they end up sort of making these really, really fine level distinctions to sort of sort out the best. And it's not really clear that it's a meaningful difference in that. And ultimately, this gets back to the title that I gave for this portion, which is, what are we trying to achieve? What are the things that we value as researchers, and for that matter, as institutions as well? So, for instance, many people in, say, the biomedical sciences are very, very interested in developing treatments and cures for human disease. That is no surprise. That's the thing that they value. But when they're assessed, the research is often, again, maybe assessed on, well, what is the impact factor of the journal that you are publishing in? Well, there's a disconnect there between those two things, between what is it that interests me as a medical researcher, for instance, versus what are the things that I have to do to ensure that I have a career, and that I get promotion, that I'm being assessed and so forth. And similarly, the same thing can happen with institutional values. So in many places, there are universities that are really trying to grapple with the lack of diversity in their faculty, the kinds of research that they are doing. And they have made that a priority to try to improve that aspect of their research culture. And again, you can have a mismatch. So if this is something that you value, but you're still assessing researchers in terms of the journal venues where they are publishing their research, is that necessarily helping you advance the thing that you value? So, given some of these issues with purely numeric assessment, it's worth looking back at sort of the other end of the continuum and think about, well, what are some of the benefits that we can have if we incorporate more qualitative assessments? And before I go on to this, I want to say one thing, which is an accusation about DORA that people sometimes say, that DORA takes the position, go back for a second, that we should not use quantitative assessment at all. That is not the position of DORA. This DORA does not say you should not use any metrics or any kind of numeric evidence at all. It tries to argue for something which is more nuanced. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But certainly when we think about as I was starting to say, bringing back in, maybe going more and bringing in more of the qualitative kinds of assessment, there are things that we can do with that. And you might call this something that many academics are familiar with: expert level assessment, peer review, which is also a form of expert assessment. Those people are able to provide context to the research. So when I talked before about, say, Charles Darwin as a biologist, my background in biology, I can say, why is it important? Why was his work important? I can contextualize that. Maybe somebody who is in a different field might not be able to do that so well. And similarly, that kind of expert level of view can perhaps provide more depth. And also, when you're doing that, you're also essentially getting community buy-in. Other people in your community are saying, yes, we think that this research is relevant and valuable to our community as well. And as I said, in terms of what DORA is interested in, we're interested in that assessment not really, we are not against quantitative assessment overall. That is not the goal. We want them to be used in context so that we end up with a research assessment that is, first of all, transparent. People know how they're being assessed. The calculations can be replicated, that it's fair, that it's nuanced, and that it's broad, so that not just single kinds of scholarly research is being valued and other kinds are being completely ignored. That's another major issue for DORA. And we think that there's a lot of advantages to this, that if you improve the assessment, you will also improve the research. By doing things like focusing on, well, what is the individual work that you are looking at, not the venue that it is being published in. And as I mentioned before, we're looking for wider ranges of scholarly products. So I'll use, for example, computer science. In many cases, there's not just the journal article itself, but there's things like the code that is produced. That is work as well. Why can't we assess the fact that somebody created code that is used in a Python library or some other kind of situation, or somebody creates a tool or provides a data set that other researchers are able to take and build on, right? And so DORA is trying to promote all of these things, is interested in community engagement, in developing resources, in partnering with other organizations, and so forth. And so to get to the second part, what are some of the other ways of assessment getting away from, again, journal impact factor and some other kinds of common ways? One of the resources on the DORA website that we have is one that's called 5 Ideas for Action. And it's just a single page, single summary, and it provides these 5 ideas that we can talk a little bit about. Ensuring that there's standards and structure, that there's people are accountable. One that I think is really, really important is this idea of transparency. I've seen people in a lot of cases who just sort of get told, just do good science or just do good research. And they're not really given a real clear sense of what the person on the other end thinks that means. And as I've talked about before, the idea of a portfolio view, of broadening out the kinds of measures of success rather than just publications that can be counted. And we're also very interested in this idea that, that assessment is ongoing rather than these single points of pass or fail, success or failure. And the idea that you have constant improvement in your research assessment processes. DORA recognizes that different institutions are at different points along this process in terms of thinking about how to assess research, reforming how they assess research. And it's not reasonable. We don't expect that an institution is going to be able to make all of those changes at once. That there's going to be small changes that you can make along the way that will improve. So you may initially look at, well, your job advertisements. Are they mentioning things like impact factor? Then maybe you can talk about your hiring processes. And then working through all of these different places where you're assessing research. You don't have to do it all at once. Excuse me. And another thing in terms of thinking about what are alternate ways that we can assess things, one thing I think is really useful is to think not so much about the outputs of research, which traditionally has been the way that people have assessed, right? You build your CV of your publications, right? Of the number of students trained, the things that come out at the end of the process. And particularly with publications, many of those things are not really within your control, right? I certainly have been in situations where there were peer reviewers who took longer than I think they should have, or maybe made unreasonable comments. Um, where editors took a very long time to make a decision. And sometimes I've had publications where the time it took from submission to publication took longer than the actual research itself. None of that was under my control. But that affected my output, right? My publication output. But there was nothing I could do about it. I did everything correct, but this affected my research. So another way that we can think about how to evaluate is to think about what are the things that are under a researcher's control. What are the practices that, again, getting back to what are the things we value? There's a lot of interest in open science, not just open access, which is about the publication itself, but opening up the process to make it more broadly replicable. So being able to do things like sharing data sets, code, and these sorts of things. These are things that are 100% within the researcher's control. I can choose to run a small little experiment that I might be able to get out faster, but that has a very small sample size, is maybe prone to spurious results. And on the other hand, I could take the time to make a better designed project that has a larger sample size and is more likely to hold up over time, making sure that who is considered to be an author on my paper. That's another thing that is within the control of the authors within this, and that you don't have people who are being added in or so forth, that you're ensuring that your trainees are getting due credit, appropriate credit for the work that they do. This is something that could be assessed in some way, in terms of, people could be asked, what are the things that you're doing to contribute to the fact that your research is solid, reproducible, that your trainees are getting good experiences, that they are getting due credit for their training. In addition to just looking at what comes out at the end by whatever means foul or fair. Another thing that DORA has been very interested in and has been involved in for the past few years is the idea of narrative CVs, which are, again, more on the qualitative side. And now this term you might have encountered in some other name. There's a lot of variation in the way that this is being implemented and what the name that it is being called. But the idea is that in addition to the traditional academic CV, which, as we talked about before, is that list of publications typically or outputs, to ask people about what are some of the other ways that you can talk about your success and your influence. And I'll give just an example here that came from the Royal Society out of the United Kingdom a few years ago. And they called it the resume for researchers. It's one variation of this idea of a narrative CV. And it asks 4 questions. Have you contributed to the generation of knowledge? So this is the straight science or the research. What have you contributed to your research field? Development of individuals. This is your job as a faculty member in training individuals. How have you contributed to the growth of your doctoral students, postdoctoral students, the students that you work with, or your colleagues for that matter, not just students, although that's the obvious one we tend to think of. We can also think about not just your own research field, but the wider research community. Are you taking actions, perhaps doing other kinds of things to serve the research community, perhaps sitting on editorial boards, engaging in peer reviewers. And then finally, what is your research doing to the broader society? I've had some of my research, for instance, that involved the pet trade, the aquariums. People keep things in aquariums, and that people are not always responsible. They let things out of aquariums. Pets get loose and they can cause problems. And some of the research that I did about pets became read by people who are involved in the civil service in making policy decisions. And that is something that in a traditional CV is kind of difficult to capture because it's not a traditional output, but it is definitely impacting decisions that affect broader society. Okay? And this is something that a few different organizations are working on, and they're trying it out. One thing that with a narrative CV and more generally qualitative assessments that comes up frequently is people say, well, it's going to take more time. And there's actual, again, research on the research about how the narrative CVs are being implemented. So funding agencies are trying this out, and they are really seeing what their peer reviewers, their panel members are saying about this process. And some of the research that is saying so far is that, well, it's not taking all that much more time to use this different form of evaluation. Now, again, the devil's in the details, as the saying goes. In other words, the details are important about how you implement something like narrative CVs. It can be done poorly. It can be done well. But I mean, certainly the idea that just it's going to take too long. So far, the evidence is no, it's not taking too long. And I just sort of want to end this portion of the talk with just this was a completely unsolicited comment that I saw on social media talking about one university from my home province in Canada signed DORA, and somebody there saying, you know, we've seen positive changes, really like some of the changes where they're not just counting numbers anymore. They're not just counting publications because the institution, you know, really bought into some of these ideas and is, you know, getting buy-in from the faculty, getting implementing them in really, really well. Now, as I mentioned, in terms of if some of these things interest you and you're interested in supporting this, one of the things that you can do, of course, is become one of the people who signs on to DORA. As I said, we're looking forward to hopefully having 25,000 signatories. I think there will be a big celebration in our headquarters the day that we hit 25,000. And, you know, so you as an individual can sign DORA. We also encourage people to ask their departments or their colleges or, you know, to ask their institutions if they would be willing to sign DORA. We have provided, you know, we have a resource library, we have Reformscape, we have a lot of tools that can help people who are interested in implementing change to sort of find some of the ways that other institutions are going about this. And if you have any success stories, we would love to hear them. And I think that is my last a little bit of acknowledgments for some of the organizations that have supported us over time. But I'm sorry, that was a little longer than I anticipated, but I will stop there. And I see that there are some messages in the chat, which I am unfortunately I cannot read. But if there are any questions in the chat, hopefully somebody will translate them for me if there are questions. So.
Zen, thank you very much for your illuminating talk and very inspiring. And I suggest that before we come to the question and answer part of the meeting, that you tell us a few more technical words about the new system that you announced, the Reformscape?
Yes,
Because this is, I understand, something, a concrete system of assessment.
Certainly. Let me just briefly here. I think that the easiest way to do this is to just I will put a link into the chat here, and let me just show you what this looks like. So I will share my screen again. So if you There we go. So this is what the initial landing page looks like. One way to think about what Reformscape is that it is an observatory for research policies. And this is our most recent tool. And so as you can see here, it asks you, show me documents related to something. And we have various fields that you can search here. So let's see, I'm wondering if currently, I don't think that we have Poland in our mix of locations. I will just put Europe. And there's various subdisciplines that you could, subfields that you can select. And then what this will do is that this will find, in this particular case, this is the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. So that's why it's not in one country, because this particular lab is in multiple European countries. And you see that what we have here are two policies that are related. These are publicly available policies related to this particular institution. And if you expand this, you can be taken to an institution profile that will tell you a little bit about what they are doing, the discipline that they're in, and so forth. And it shows you the resources that are related to that particular institution. And right now, you can also see how many people are clicking these links or have done so in the past. Eventually, we're going to allow people to sort of sort by most viewed, most downloaded, those kinds of things. But because the tool just launched, initially, of course, the number was 0 for everything. So there was no way to use that information. There was no information to sort or to show. And if we just click on, say, the research assessment here, it breaks it down and tells you what it is. And this goes directly to that resource online. So really, this is trying to compile. Let's go back to Reformscape here. This is trying to compile as many different policies from places that are actively engaged in changing their research assessment. And we're trying to bring in as many as we can. Currently, we recognize that it is a little centered towards English-speaking countries. And part of the reason for that is because all of the members of the team that were involved in this are English speakers. And we didn't want to be in a situation where we had a policy and we didn't really understand the nuances of the policy. We're really trying to think about ways that we can expand out and get to, say, other languages such as Polish, for instance. But that was an initial decision to keep some of those things. And we can go back here to the homepage. Let's say that you're interested, particularly, let's say you're on a search committee and you're interested in hiring decisions, and you want to look just for the documents related to hiring. And let's say you are interested in hiring assistant professors. You notice that it shows you the number that live. So hiring was initially 70. As soon as I put in assistant professors, it changed down to 4. So if that was your particular, you can really target some of these things. And these are policies that are related specifically to assistant professors, and hiring decisions. So you can really drill down and look for quite specific kinds of policies within this. And you see over on the right-hand side that all the data that is in this website is all available for download. So again, we try to practice open science practices. Um, and we are also looking for resources, new resources. So our hope is really that this will continue to grow and expand. This is definitely a starting point for this tool. It is not a finished product, and we are going to be adding more and more policies to it as the community brings them to us. And of course, we're going to be looking for those things ourselves, but this is something that we really hope that the community will be assisting us with. So that is our most recent tool to make the good work that some organizations doing much more easily much easier for other people who are interested in these things to be able to find, right? So if you're in a department and have a question about how can we change our tenure practices, our promotion practices, you can now look and say, well, what are they doing in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, in some of these other places? And you can find those hopefully much more readily than just trying to do searches on the search engine.
Well, thank you very much again. I think this is very convincing for me. And the floor is open for questions. Please raise your virtual hands, because in this way I'll be able to identify people who want to ask questions. A moment of hesitation. If somebody prefers to ask question in Polish, then I will translate it. And an information for Zen, what I have seen on the chat part, there is one, because in general there were greetings and thanks to you, but there is a question from Jacek Klich. What about DORA's influence or impact on national science policy or policies?
There's multiple that I can talk about. We do have at the national level, I am proud, because I am Canadian, to say that one of our biggest successes has been in Canada. This was not due to the fact that this is just coincidental. I was not involved in this. But Canada's major government funding agencies, there are three of them. There's one for health sciences, one for science and engineering, and one for the social sciences and humanities. These three agencies are collectively called the Tri-Council. And a few years ago, the Tri-Council in Canada signed on to DORA. So that is the major federal funding agencies for the entire nation of Canada have now signed on to DORA, and they are slowly changing. They are changing some of the ways that they implement or they review their grant proposals. And because of this, there has been much more interest in DORA at the institutional level as well. I mentioned the University of Calgary. A few other major Canadian research universities have recently signed or are considering signing. So that has really, really changed the landscape of research assessment within Canada, was having these funding agencies come on board. And one of the things that it happened as well, there was something that in Canada called the Common CV, which was absolutely hated by Canadian researchers, and that went away. And now there's a section that is attempting to do some of the things with the narrative CV that we talked about. So it allows people to talk about things like alternate forms of success. It allows them to talk about career interruptions for parenthood or other kinds of different alternative pathways, or if they have been ill, for instance. There are probably some ways that that could be improved in how it's been implemented. But that is, I think, one of our current biggest successes. And of course, because I am Canadian, of course, I have to mention that as well. And otherwise, the other thing that I will say in terms of not so much at the national level, in terms of working with governments, but DORA is involved with many organizations that are, major funding agencies. So some of our supporters, such as the HHMI, the Swiss National Science Foundation, Science Foundation Ireland, are involved in our funders discussion group. And they are trying some things like the narrative CVs and so forth, even though they're not. So it's really not being set so much by government, either at the federal, state, provincial level, or so forth. It's really coming in from some of the funding agencies that are quite often associated. They're government agencies that are having some of these influences. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. So the first oral question comes from Olgierd.
Thank you for voice, and thank you for the lecture. Especially, this is very encouraging to think out of the system we all knew, and we also knew how this functionally works, but to make a proposition of a completely different kind of organization of it. And I've got 3 questions for you. The first thing is how to manage you mentioned Carl Darwin, and when you're talking about such people or some person like Immanuel Kant or Albert Einstein, how to get those people in progress, the genius who are not revealed to the world, and how to encourage them and how to make an institutionalized possibilities them to develop, especially to the proposition of DORA, and how to encourage them, especially in those mostly personal problems that they have. The second one is how to measure impact of the social environment of the publishing or codes or scientific work. Is it some kind of going to the debate of each particular example, or is there a more systematic approach? And the last question I'd like to ask you, this more proposition or project rather than question, that's to make a holistic and whole community discussion, especially in university, after publishing a scientific work. It is the combining the student's voice and make it as a way of socialization of the ability to form it as soon as possible. For example, not only the scholarship, the person in the university is publishing an article, and also there is a master thesis for the student, and making a debate, including the topic of how to measure its effectiveness and how to treat it for the good of the society and make it some kind of ritual. And the last point of the question proposition is how to encourage universities to do this. Maybe some kind of project, the grants and other kind of it. Thank you.
That's a lot. Thank you. Let me. I may try to rephrase those questions a little bit, and just to make sure that I understand them. So, if I ask for clarification, please bear with me. So I think the first question that you talked about is really a question about long-term assessment. So, you mentioned Kant, Einstein, Darwin. I know Darwin famously had the idea for natural selection, and he worked on it for 20 years, which is not the sort of time frame that is typical of academic culture right now. There's been many jokes about Darwin's grant proposal: collect every conceivable fact, wait 20 years, write book. That would never be funded by any funding agency today. But that's basically what he did. And I think that it's interesting because in theory, tenure is supposed to allow people to have the freedom to pursue those long-term projects. The assessment cycle typically has kind of worked against that notion of providing the stability that tenure affords. Because even if the position is tenured and very, very stable, the money may not be. And there's many people who talk about how can we we have to do annual assessment. We have grants only last for 3 years, and these sorts of things. So how can we support people who want to do these very, very long-term projects? And I think that some of the things that I talked about may be relevant here. One of which is to sort of move away from the just focusing on the output and being able to show progress on research, perhaps in other kinds of ways. By perhaps releasing data on an ongoing project, might be one way to show that something isn't just sitting, that you are actually working on a project. And some of the other sorts of things that can be, I think, helpful to people with trying to create these long-term projects is to create mechanisms for that. There's unfortunately not a lot of places right now that are thinking about 5-year grants, 10-year grants, at some kind of level of support. They're typically shorter than that. But certainly, I think that is how do we assess people who have their eyes on a very, very long-term goal, a big but slow to achieve goal. I think some fields do this better than others. I think astronomy is a good example where they really have to take the long-term view, because if you want to send a mission to Pluto or to the outer solar system, many of those projects are handed off, from one person to another, because it takes so long to launch a space telescope, send them outer planetary mission. It can take years. That really can take decades. So I don't know that field very, very well. There may be some lessons to be learned from those kinds of areas as well. So that's my attempt to answer the first question, which I hope kind of gets to some of the things that you're talking about. The second question, I think that you're talking a little bit about the social environment and research culture. I know that there are some places that are really starting to think about research culture, the environment that people are working in. In the United Kingdom, this has become incorporated into their assessment, which is the Research Excellence Framework, or better known as just the REF, R-E-F. Research culture is starting to be incorporated into that assessment. I am not very familiar with that and where that is right now. I know there's been quite a bit of discussion about that within the UK, but I don't have a huge amount of detail about that right now. But certainly that research culture is something that many places are starting to consider, and they're thinking about how can we assess that. I don't necessarily know that any place is very far along in thinking about how can we assess culture, because culture is one of those things that is kind of an intangible, right? We know it's there, it's real, it's important, but it can be difficult to get a handle on. In terms of the last couple of things, how to encourage universities. I think one thing here is what we see is that in some cases, it's really variable. Some places, universities have been very reluctant to sign DORA even because they don't want to make public commitments. This is particularly true in North America. And we've had some success where not universities, but say departments within universities have signed DORA, or colleges within a university have signed DORA. And they have used that to sort of start creating the push within their larger leadership about, we have signed DORA. These are the changes. These are the things that we want to do within our departmental evaluation. Because in many cases, the departments in many institutions do actually have a lot of power in research assessment. Research assessment is primarily vested and performed by the faculty's department and less so by the higher levels of administration. So that is something that we have seen as well. And again, as funding agencies come on and they start talking about DORA principles, universities follow money. And if a funding agency says, we are following DORA principles and we want to make sure that we are not using these kinds of assessments, some universities are going to look at that and go, well, if they're not using these things like journal impact factor in their assessments of the research grant, maybe we shouldn't be assessing that either, because if we're asking our faculty one thing in their assessment, but the funding agency is saying, no, we're not interested in that at all. You would hope that administrators would eventually see that there's a disconnect, and that is setting up their faculty for failure by requiring one thing that is actually not going to help with the funding and so forth. There was another question in there about, I put in bringing student voice after publication. I may have to come back to that or ask for a little clarification. So hopefully those answered the questions, and the last one I'll maybe think about a little more while I'm dealing with other questions.
Okay, so now Jacek Jassem, professor of Gdańsk Medical University.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. The system of evaluation in science has long been debated, and I'm very happy to learn about your approach. Indeed, the purely numerical assessment is unfair and not really objective. However, it has never been so far replaced by any other system. I believe mainly due to its simplicity and the no need for a real assessment of the merits. However, I wonder how do you make it? Maybe you have some case story to show us, because if you assess particular items, for example, you gave us a list of 4 items, you probably score each of these items, and you also take into consideration some bibliometric data in addition to this qualitative assessment. So at the end of the day, you probably have some scoring, you make some numerical assessment. So how technically do you combine these aspects? This is my first question.
Mm.
The second question is, a part of individual assessment, also institutions are evaluated. So how can you apply your system to institutional assessments?
Okay, I'm just making a couple of notes for myself here to hopefully answer your question a little better. I will say that the issue of scoring, when you have some of these qualitative aspects to a proposal, in addition to the quantitative, is challenging. And I will say that the example from Canada that I mentioned before, where there is essentially a section where people can write pretty much whatever they want. It's kind of an unstructured opportunity to write. So you can talk about parental responsibilities, illness, career deviations, other evidence of success. And I have heard informally that this has turned out to be very, very difficult for the reviewers because there's not enough guidance about, well, how do I how do I compare an applicant who lost a year of research because of long COVID versus a researcher who lost 2 years because of they had a child, but they have more money for something else, or these kinds of things. And people are struggling with that. So I'm certainly not going to say that, oh, no, it's easy. That is a very real concern. And I think that part of that solution does become really being thoughtful about, if you're going to add in some of these qualitative elements, is really structuring that and really thinking about, well, what are some of the things that we want to get? And that's why I showed that 4-question example, because it's it is still evidence-based and it is still fairly targeted, so that you're not left with just kind of everything being thrown into one, anything that somebody wants to write. I think that is a real concern. And then how you sort of turn that into a score, even if that score is a decision, a yes/no decision, is, I think, something that people are going to go through. I do think that this is one of the reasons why in many cases, you have panels, you have sort of get people's different opinions, and you go to that sort of expert level assessment to try and get different points of view on these kinds of decisions. In terms of institutional assessment, now that is a little bit out of DORA's scope there, because when you're talking about institutional assessment, you're really talking about things like university rankings, I think. And the fact that, for good or bad, things like the individual researchers, things like research expenditures, Nobel Prizes, all kinds of things are quite often factored into institution ranks, which quite often are, many universities try to do a lot to manipulate or to climb up their ranks. So there are some initiatives that are similar to DORA. There is one called More Than Our Rank, or MTOR, MTOR, that is very interested in the question of university rankings in particular. DORA is more about the individual researcher assessment. The COARA in Europe I believe has, I think, some interest in the university rankings, perhaps more so than DORA. But again, I don't have a clear knowledge about what Kawara has been doing in that space. But so there are certainly people who are thinking about institutional assessment in a way that DORA has not been. So that's, we're interested, but it's not something that DORA has been focused on particularly in our own activities.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the questions. Okay.
Well, you are invited to ask more questions.
I do see the one other in the chat about comments on Terra. So Project Terra, Reformscape, which I showed you a few moments ago, is part of Project Terra. It's one of three major aspects to that project, which has been running for a few years and ends the funding ends this year. So we'll be then continuing on with that. So Reformscape is part of Terra, and there's other things. Terra is short for Tools to Advance Research Assessment. Another was a survey of research assessment practices, particularly, I believe, in North America. And so when you see if you go to Reformscape, you'll see there's part of Project Terra, and we have a few other one-page tools. So one that is very popular is called Building Blocks for Assessment, and it talks about different dimensions of research assessment. Again, trying to think about more broader forms of assessment. And it uses the recent Nobel laureate, Caitlin Caraco, her work, which was, she famously was doing this work that led to, in part, mRNA being used in COVID vaccinations, and her work was not valued. She, now has a Nobel Prize, but she had been passed over for a faculty position. So her story is an interesting one, right? Because sort of to get back to the question before about Darwin Kant, how do we support someone like Caitlin Caraco, who's working on something that ultimately she is vindicated on, but at the time did not really fit into that kind of assessment box in terms of the things that she was looking at. So let me have a look here. I see another comment here about the national evaluation scheme in Poland. This is something I am very interested in, actually, because one of the things and one of the reasons that I am so glad to speak to you today is that in this position, I talked to a lot of other people in funding agencies and policy and so forth, and it can be very difficult for me to sort of know what the situation is for people like yourselves in different countries that we are not familiar with. What some people might call the ground truth. What is it like on the ground? It is sometimes difficult for me in my position to know that. So I am very interested and would be very happy to talk to people more about what is going on in Poland. I do not know the education system in Poland, if it is handled at the national level like it is in some countries, or whether it's handled at a state or provincial level as it is in Canada or the US. I freely confess my ignorance of the situation in Poland and would be delighted to know more about what the problems are facing Polish researchers. That's very important to me to know what are the problems that researchers are facing in their day-to-day job. I'll stop there.
Professor Klich, do you want to comment on that?
I'm fully satisfied. Thank you very much. You inspired me to look closer to Tara because I haven't had enough time to go through all the tools there, but I do expect that some of them could be on in one way or another, to some extent, applicable to the Polish situation. By the way, I share Professor Jacek Sroka's comments on chat regarding, the real chances for implementation of DORA ideas. As you very rightly said, because our system is very, very, very specific. And it is centralized, highly centralized. So now forget about, of course, nominally universities are free, but
Yes.
and this is the problem of so thank you very much. You inspired me to look much closer to Tara and the tools, because that's what I'm especially interested in.
I hope that as you continue to look at them, that they will be useful, continue to be useful to you. I will say that, if there are opportunities where DORA can, participate in trying to drive some of these conversations to convince leadership, that is one of our mandates, right? And we'd be happy to try and figure out how best we can assist with that. And certainly the challenges of having a centralized system, they are real, right? Because if you have to convince a small number of people. But I will say that in some cases, the advantage is if you actually can convince the right people, you can see very positive change happen very, very quickly. In looking at where institutions have signed DORA, for instance, we see a lot of activity in Europe because many of those places are centralized and basically the national policy gets set. Proportionately, there's less activity on DORA in the United States because that is handled, higher education is handled at the state level. So there's not one situation in the United States, there's 50, one for each state. And it gets even more dispersed than that. So proportionately, trying to get American institutions to buy on board to DORA has been one of our challenges, but certainly, yes, I certainly can empathize with the challenges, again, with DORA trying to have this global perspective, we see the range of all different kinds, and we really try to, be responsive to those different realities. And this is, we have, on our steering committee, we try to have people from different countries, different continents, and we're trying to be very mindful of that variation. So, but and I will say one, you know what, I will put one more thing in here, that if anyone wants to follow up with me about any of these things later, I will just put in my email because it's actually not on the website. We just have a form. But if you want to get me personally directly, copy that email, put it in your contacts, and whenever you need it, and you just say, hey, on February 29th, you talked to our group, and that's where I saw you, and this is how I got your email. Follow up with me, and I'll see what I can do to assist anyone. That's my job. That's what I am here to do.
Thank you, Zen. Since there are no questions at the moment, and we have still 9 minutes, and there is, I understand, one pending question, yes, the third question of Olgierd, that you suggested to answer at the end. Did I
yes. So
understood you correctly?
yes, let me ask if you remember the question. I did write it down briefly, but I don't think I quite understood your question, which was, I believe, involves students. Could I ask you to just restate that question, and I'll try again to answer it,
Sure, thank
if
you.
you would like.
I'd love to, because it is a situation that I think it is connected to your answer to my first question about the culture and the academy as an archetype and socialization. And I'd ask, is there any possibility to found not only discussion among the pros, the academics who are very and to get the students to, as the element of their curriculum or the initiative, to be involved in such discussions and together work about the ethics, about how to measure both quality and quantitative, and especially to encourage universities to make the step of making such dialogue.
Yes. Okay, so how do we... It's true that when you look at Reformscape, it is mainly geared towards faculty. And for me, I've told my colleagues, one of the reasons I am in this job is to make a difference for graduate students and postdocs, the early career researchers. And this is getting to some things that I have sort of noted personally, not so much things that DORA has worked on, but something that I have noted is that I was surprised to see a few years ago, because this was not the system that I grew up in. And again, I think it's really important to keep that global perspective of just how many institutions required publications from their students to graduate. And like not just a publication, but I saw there were some cases that I found where some students had to have like, I don't know, it was something like 5 peer-reviewed publications. You had to be first author on them. And I think that there are even some institutions that say they must be in the Web of Science, or no, like has to have an impact factor, or it has to be in Scopus. And you have all of these things that really have nothing to do with the students' research. And I think are really ways for departments to kind of inflate their numbers. And I sort of see some reasons to say, yes, students, if they're going to be professional scientists, they should publish in journals because that's what we are expected to do as professional scientists. But to have this very long list of expectations of publication can really, again, that's not within a student's control. And you could interfere with the student's ability to graduate and all of these sorts of things. This is me speaking personally, not as DORA Program Director. I see many, many problems with that. And so that is, I think, one thing that I think I would love to see institutions really think about what they're doing there. Something else that we have started thinking about with DORA, I have a project working with one of our policy associates where we started to look at how students are being assessed at conferences. So when one of the things that students, typically it's like what's their first line in their CV, is quite often a poster presentation at a conference. And quite often there are poster competitions. So working with our policy associate, we've been looking at the way students are evaluated at conferences. And that is one place where there's no journal impact factor because they just look at the poster. But it's like, well, what are they being asked about on the poster? Are they being asked questions about their content? Are they being assessed on the way that they're dressed, which has many, can be potentially problematic? Is it about the way they present it? how, or are they even told if there's a poster competition? Are they even told how they're being assessed? In many cases, no, they're not. So that is, I can sort of see if we sort of put a little work into saying, here's how students are being assessed in conferences and very, very early on. That is something I would like to see sort of, I would like DORA to sort of document as a little side project. And again, I think that there's a perception sometimes that students are going to be the ones who are going to make the change. Sometimes I'm not sure that's the case. I think that sometimes students have to be sold on the idea that, because again, I can certainly see the idea, the lure of, wow, it would be really nice to have a paper in this journal, right? Where there's all these results. People who I respect have published in this journal. I want to be in that journal as well. So it's very easy to see how some of those signals creep down into students. Some students, however, are very, very interested in open science and open access, these kinds of things. Others are not. And I think that it really is the case we shouldn't assume that students will automatically be on board with DORA principles. You're right to think that this is something that we should be reaching out to them some more. And that is personally something I would like to do more of. As I said, I miss talking to faculty and I miss talking to grad students and postdocs because I talk to too many other senior policy people and funding agency people, and I miss having students around. That's been the one downside of not being a working professor anymore. But that's okay. I hope that addresses some of your question.
Yes, thanks. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Zen. Since time is coming to the end, I'm going to close the session soon, but before I do it, thank you very much, Zen, of course, in the first place. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk. And I have two messages to all of you. First is that a week from now, the 7th of March, same time, same place, we are going to have a lecture delivered by Professor Yuli Tamir, president of Beit Belk College from Israel, and she will talk about the situation on Israeli universities. The second message is about a document that some of you probably signed, the document that was a sort of a summary and recommendations coming from our seminar to the Ministry of Science and Higher Education. We have collected 225 signatures under the document, and we are supposed to be received by Vice Minister Gdula from the ministry. I mean the steering committee of the seminar, but the invitation came suddenly, and that was tonight, and so only Professor Giza Poleszczuk was able to answer to this invitation, and this is at this moment she's probably handing this document to the minister, to Professor Gdula. So week from now we shall learn from her what was the reaction of minister and the ministerium probably. With this, I thank you very much. I'm sure that many of us will sign to DORA. I did it a few years ago already, and understand the individuals may sign as well. Yes, Zen? Yeah, so I encourage everybody. I think it is very important to support this movement, and see you a week from now.